Good morning, South Rock, and welcome to week 30, chapter 30 of the Story Devotions. This and the next one are the end of the story. It's been quite a 2021 to do this with you. But this chapter is all about the end of Paul's life and some of the letters that he wrote and some of the things he's had to say towards the end of his life. Now, what I want to talk about today and what I want to devote you to is something that is talked about a lot in church. And it's the thing from Ephesians that says, wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives. Now, I don't want to touch on those because there's a lot to unpack and I have very strong opinions about it. First of all, we often neglect the fact that the husband section is twice as long as the wife section. We often really hammer home the wives submit, and by we I mean the general church, not our church specifically, but we also neglect the fact that the wives section isn't an imperative verb. It's not wives submit like a stop sign. It's more like wives, you ought to submit, or you should want to submit, while the husband section is an imperative. Husbands, you need to, you have to love your wives. But what I want to bring your attention to is the sentence right before this starts, which is the sentence, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Something we don't skip over, but it really edifies, it really sets up this whole section and really the whole idea of submission to your spouse. Because yes, even the husbands love your wives. It's about submission. Love your wives as Jesus loved the church. And how did Jesus love the church? By submitting to death, by dying for it. And so this sentence, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, is so important for our relationships within the church, for our relationship with the church and with Christ. We ought to be submissive to each other. We ought to be less, be made less, be humble, and seek out humility in our relationships with each person in the church, because we are one body that makes up one church, which is the bride of Christ. And so how can we do that? And that's really what I want to devote you to. It's a hard subject to think about and dwell on because we don't want to. We don't want to be submissive. We don't want to be made less. It's not a natural instinct to seek out humility, to seek out not our own interests. And some people are really good at it, but most people aren't. And so what I want to devote you to is this sentence. I want you to repeat it. I want you to write it down. I want you to think about it all the time. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. How can we do that? How can we do that better every day? How can we submit to our relationships in the church? How can we submit to the church, both the local one at South Rock and the universal one? How can we submit to people that don't follow Christ, but we know we need to serve them and love them? How can we be better servants? It starts with submission and humility, but we need to do it because we revere and love and respect and admire, even sometimes fear, the God that saved us through Christ. So that's what I have today. It's a heavy topic. It's a tough topic, thinking about submitting and being a servant and not being proud and made lofty, but to be less. And so I want you to think about it and try and do it this week and try and do it going forward. This is a very important verse for how the church works in unity and love and grace. So think about it and devote yourselves to it. So that's all I have for week 30, chapter 30. So we'll see you next week for the final chapter, the final week of the story. So I'll see you next time.